Right, welcome everybody. Does anybody remember the book The Martian? Yeah. The book, the film. So after a long wait, there's a sequel. In fact, there's been a book in between called Artemis, but there's a new one out called Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, which my youngest son has read. And I grabbed it as soon as he's finished it. And I haven't got all the way through. So please, if you've read it, no spoilers. But I have got to an interesting bit in which a Dutch scientist representing a united world government created to defend planet Earth from an incoming swarm of algae says to the hero of the book that she wants him to devote himself, to stop what he's doing being a school teacher and devote himself to defending the world from these algae that are blotting out the sun. And he says, "Can you really do that?" And she says, "Yes, I can. I have all of the authority." And there's a wonderful scene after that as well, where she is backed by representatives of Russia, China, the United States, the EU, in a room watching him do his work on some algae. And for a brief moment there, you get a glimpse of what might be if you had a functioning world government. Forgive the preamble, it's on my mind, it's a great book. But it's not like that in the real world. There is no united world government. There's not much consensus in the world now, even on basics like democracy. Instead, I think I'm not stretching it to say we live in a time of division, polarization. We definitely live in a time of Brexit, of Trumpism, and of war. And a feeling here in the UK that after 13 years with the same team in charge, we're failing on many fronts. Batty ideas to go send refugees to Rwanda, the NHS on its knees, most of the political discussion about the party in power, and underlying it all, the cost of Brexit. But at least we are joined by Professor Ben Ansell from Oxford University, who has written this great book on why politics fails, and our very own Tortoise political editor, Cat Neilan, who has the book on her lap.
It's annotated, so I'm afraid I can't sell it to anyone here.
You can't return it either.
And by way of introduction, I'm Giles Whitell. I'm an editor here, and this is a ThinkIn, an especially warm welcome to all those of you from the Institute of Constructive Journalism in Denmark. I gather that you're not just from the Institute, but you're from a whole array of Danish media outlets. Thank you very much for coming. We're very flattered. I gather you've been to the BBC earlier today. This is where the magic really happens. But yes, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is a ThinkIn. This is, we're going to hear obviously from Ben and Kat, but I really want to hear from you as well. We have a rule which isn't really a rule and is easily misunderstood. And it goes like this: no questions. And that doesn't mean no talking. We're not in North Korea. It means just say whatever you like. It doesn't have to be a question, right? We want to hear what you think. And I'm sure you all bring a tremendous opinion and knowledge to this debate. Do raise your hands if you are from Denmark. Great. And now from that group, would you raise your hands again if you think your politics is failing? Okay, so I reckon less than a third of you are of that opinion. Raise your hands if you are not from Denmark. Okay, so slightly under half the room. And raise your hands again if you think politics is failing. Right. So you guys from Denmark, you've come to somewhere where the consensus is politics is failing. Ben, you write in the book, I'm not going to try and summarize the argument, which is, except that I am, But it is nuanced. But the great thing about it is it can also be summarized. It's about how the clash between individual and collective interests is giving bad outcomes in terms of democracy, equality, solidarity, which I think of a little bit like fraternité in French revolutionary language, security and prosperity. So my first question is, are we dealing here with all those at once? Do we have a perfect storm of failed politics?
So if you write a book called Why Politics Fails, there's a real risk for your publisher, which is that politics will succeed by the time that the book comes out. But that didn't happen, so I was lucky. So there's a...
When did you start it, by the way? Because
in 2019, before COVID.
Right.
So the fact that there is a discussion of COVID there in the security chapter and the trade-offs between what I call anarchy and tyranny, which, if you like, are South Dakota and Wuhan, China, like very different ways of dealing with the pandemic. I had those ideas, and then reality intervened and reinforced those ideas. I would guess, I hope, that you read the book, and in 6 months' time, when something none of us can imagine is going to happens, you say, oh, that sucks, but at least I can explain it from this chapter of Ben's book. The five areas, to repeat them again: democracy, equality, solidarity. Yeah, in a way, that's really the welfare state. And there's lots of talking about how wonderful Denmark and Sweden are in that chapter. Security and prosperity. These are really big areas. I mean, I'm covering almost every imaginable thing that we would collectively want. And again, the argument I make is, well, every time we get to these things that we collectively want, the same type of problem happens, which is that our individual self-interests and what's good for us collectively get in the way of each other. And that's not just the fault of our politicians, that's us. So one way I try and describe this is to say the book is an act of political therapy. Right? So if you go and see a therapist, a good therapist allegedly, I mean, people have different views about what constitutes good therapy, but my understanding is you go and you talk to a therapist and they help you understand yourself better, the ways in which you behave and how those might be pathological in some way. I think that's what I'm trying to do here, to say, look, actually, all of us are subject to wanting to misrepresent what we want or to misbehave in some way, unless we're being monitored. And by the way, we also don't really like being monitored. And these are pretty eternal questions that people face. The societies that we live in, especially if you live in Denmark, are better at dealing with those challenges than they were 300 years ago, where we had neither democracy, equality, solidarity, security, nor prosperity. So that's the good news. But it's also the case that certain types of political institutions, and I think the ones we have in this country are emblematic of that, can steer us into those problems. And I think there are some good things about our electoral system. Right? We know who's in charge, and therefore we know who to blame when things go wrong. But I think mostly everything else about our political system makes those things go wrong. So, you know, the bad news is our system makes things go wrong, and the good news is you can figure out who made things go wrong when that happens. So yes, I think there's something about Britain that makes it harder for us to make those decisions. It means we have to think about this even more, do even more therapy.
Right. But the stakes are pretty high. I mean, wherever you are, there's a pretty scary line early on, which is just a reminder from history that after a contested and disputed election in Spain in 1936, there followed 36 years of Franco. And so you think immediately of what might have ensued after the January, was it 6th insurrection? Or was it?
Yes.
They fall 6th, one of the two.
Yeah.
I'm panicking.
Under pressure. It's being filmed.
So yeah, the stakes are in fact high, even though we get used to this cycle of elections and a general sense of broadly speaking, stability and prosperity in the West. And yet, throughout the book, you mentioned institutions, you put a lot of faith in them, while at the same time arguing that in certain respects, in this country at any rate, they're failing. Just explain why you feel comfortable putting so much faith in these institutions, which you acknowledge are themselves often not actually that democratic themselves.
Yeah. So I mean, I would argue that most of these kind of individual versus collective problems we have happen in environments where we can do whatever we want. And the thing about political or other types of institutions is they constrain us. And that's why people like to get rid of them and like to challenge them. And that, of course, is why Parliament got prorogued and Boris Johnson threw many members of his own political party to the wolves, sort of violating even norms in the latter case or institutions in the former, because he wanted to do something that he was being constrained from doing. So institutions play an important role in this book in constraining us from our bad selves. And that I feel slightly uncomfortable with too, because that is anti-democratic. If you think of democracy as all of us choosing what we want to do exactly now and doing that thing. And so there are small L liberal parts of the book about how it might be nice to reduce equality and increase solidarity. But there is a small c conservative thread running through it, which is be careful about removing the institutions we have because they play roles that we sometimes can't see. They were designed to resolve previous conflicts mostly, right? We don't end up with new institutions that are perfectly suited to the needs we have today. And so then they frustrate us because we think, well, wait, this system is silly or it constrains us and it was created 200 years ago, so how could it possibly suit us today? But then when we get rid of those institutions, we find that the absence of them is not somehow an improvement, right? And that's the balancing act throughout the book. And I think that we all have to think about really seriously, especially over the last few years when institutions have been under serious attack.
Yeah. Cat, I want you to feel free to jump in and ask Ben anything, but I want to ask you a question first about the politicians who you spend your life watching. And there's a line at the end of Ben's book, which we were talking about earlier, because, as you said, it's essentially, apart from anything else, an expression of faith in political institutions and politicians as the best, not the best of a bad job, but what we've got and what we've got to work with. The contingent promises, you write, of politics are better than the false promises of technologists and populists. Cat, working most days from your cramped office in Westminster and talking all the time to politicians, do you broadly think they're in it for themselves or in it for the common good?
Well, we had a chat about this earlier, and I think on balance that the majority of MPs are there for the right reasons. I think that the good faith to bad faith ratio is pretty high. I mean, I think people may disagree with the political views of MPs, but I think fundamentally they're trying to make this country a better place. How you get there might be up for debate. That said, there are obviously some people who are just out for themselves and out for the power that they get. And we did talk, Giles, a bit about some of the backbenchers that sort of you don't necessarily always hear that much about, but they're kind of quietly getting on with the work, representing their constituents. A lot of MPs these days have to deal with constituencies casework, which is everything from sort of, social care to housing issues to sort of not what you kind of associate when you think of Parliament. But as well as that, they are in Westminster, doing very sort of boring, I would say, work, but important work, finessing legislation before it becomes law. And they are names that we never hear about.
But we did then hear about Charles Walker.
We did talk about a couple of my faves. Charles Walker, who I think probably people would... he made a few very principled stands during COVID. He was one of the people that spoke out most about lockdowns, which again, you can kind of disagree with his view, but, it was a principle that he held. And then last autumn, when the Liz Truss government was imploding, he kind of gave quite a sort of forceful view of the people who had put her in power and saying, you've kind of brought this all on yourself. And the other person that I mentioned is William Bragg. He, again, is a backbencher MP. Neither of these have ever been ministers. Neither of them have ever sought ministerial office. But he, again, is a I mean, both of these men are Brexiteers. Both of these men were anti-lockdown. I disagree with them on those views, but I agree with them in they are there for the right reason. They want to represent their people. And Theresa May was the other name that we discussed, having obviously been very, very senior and unusually for a former Prime Minister, still taking a very active role as a backbencher representing the people of Maidenhead.
Yeah. I'd be really interested to hear from anybody, you guys, but especially our visitors from Denmark. And this is slightly self-centered or UK-focused. What do you think we're getting wrong here? Does it look from 400 miles away 300 miles away over the North Sea as if we are getting it wrong? Yes, sir. Get a microphone and tell us your name. And I'd be interested to know.
My name's Ola Borg. I'm a journalist and I'm working at the Constructive Institute. I've been a reporter at a large Danish newspaper for several years. And I was thinking it was really interesting to hear what you said, Ben, about the electoral system. In our country, we have 12 parties in parliament. And right now we have a government consisting of the Social Democrats and the Liberals, who used to be enemies, and the moderates in the middle. So it's a government across the lines of Danish politics. When we have this electoral system in Denmark that we divide the votes fairly as to how many people voted for the different parties, so which is why you get so many parties in there. I think that the reason why the politics in Britain fails is the electoral system. Could you elaborate, I hear you agreeing, could you elaborate what's wrong with it and how could it be changed?
So, I mean, I do broadly agree with that, and I say that at the end of the book. And I have a Substack, I'm going to do advertising here, where I talk about some of these issues. Like I wrote an article called "The UK's Prosperity Trap" recently, where I spoke quite a bit about the inability in the UK to make long-run decisions, and that comes from two of our institutions. The first is our electoral system, because it leads to volatility, because we don't have coalition governments, which have their own problems that we can get to, but it's led to a lot of scorched earth policy making in this country. And one of the examples I gave in that, from when I worked for the Treasury, I worked on something called the Leach Review of Skills, which was a 20-year, I wrote a document called Skills 2020, but I wrote that in 2004. So that seemed like the future then, about long-run planning for the types of skills that Britain should deliver. There was a review set up. I worked on the review. We implemented a series of different policies, things like Train to Gain, which maybe like one person in this room will have heard of, sector skills councils of various types. We've got them all in 2009. The coalition government came in, got rid of everything that we had done within a year. So, these policies had just lasted a year. And then after a while, they realized that they needed a long-run skills plan too. And so then they started creating their own version of it. The other problem we have is that we're a unitary state. I mean, I'm excluding here the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But even in lots of areas, the policy isn't devolved either. And so that means that Westminster can decide everything for England, and often England and Wales, and sometimes for the UK, without any local resistance. So if this was Canada, or even the US, then a government couldn't just come in and do a scorched earth policy or anything, because the states or provinces would have the ability to push back. So we've kind of got the worst of both worlds here. You guys have a unitary state, but you have lots of different parties governing. But we have a unitary state and first past the post. And so we just end up with volatility and whiplash.
But isn't that volatility kind of a recent phenomenon? I think what I'm kind of interested in is, I suppose, is this a sort of a current problem, right? Like the last 5-10 years, sort of leading up to Brexit, and then in the years after Brexit, and in the case of America, obviously Trump. And actually, I think the Jan 6th example, to my mind, I feel a lot more optimistic than I think most people do, because I feel like that's an example of actually democracy did withstand that. There wasn't a coup, and so I know that it's not rosy, but it's that there are strong foundations there that have been shaken, but it survived. And I think with what we're seeing at the minute, it's still the sort of fallout from Brexit. But, to your point about sort of short-termism, I mean, we obviously had Margaret Thatcher in power and then John Major for a very, very long time, then Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And then, leaving aside the sort of internal mess of the Conservatives, we have had a Conservative government for 13 years. So it's sort of not necessarily that sort of black and white.
The volatility is not every 3 or 4 years normally.
Yeah, and how much of that is
It's also true that Thatcher was a conviction politician, deliberate. And then Blair came in and made just enormous changes to the institutional architecture of this country. And the changes that Liberals often don't really like to talk about as being kind of scorched earth in their own ways. Right? He made the Bank of England independent. He made Scotland and Wales devolved. Yep. He created a minimum wage. I mean, this all happens.
Changes to the House of Lords.
It changes, exactly. Huge institutional changes. And then we've had another series of huge institutional changes since David Cameron came in. So is volatility like that over 15 years okay? Well, I mean, maybe it is. But
isn't that baked into democracy? Because otherwise you'd have to have longer electoral cycles.
And this is the challenge, I talk about in that prosperity trap piece. To say, look, part of the problem is we're a democracy. And I mean that only slightly tongue in cheek. When I taught at a course at Oxford Policy School, we've had lots of students from Singapore, and they will always say, look, the great thing about Lee Kuan Yew is that he could plan for a 30-year horizon. And the bad thing about Lee Kuan Yew is only Lee Kuan Yew could plan for a 30-year horizon. And look, I'm an academic, and the book is about trade-offs, and there clearly are trade-offs here. I suppose I feel like we've edged too far in this one direction, and that's been building really since 2010. Like, you could look at the coalition and say, well, they were entitled to change things. They won, combined quite a lot of votes, the Conservatives and the Liberals. Theresa May had a lot of people vote for her, but somehow some of the restrictions on the types of policy change you might make do seem to have been loosened a bit more since 2019.
I see some hands up. Liz and Sophie, I want to come to you in just a second. But first, could I just come back to you, sir? You raised the Danish political system, which is based on proportional representation. Is it your feeling that it's mainly because of that so many of you, so few of you, relatively speaking, raised your hands when I asked you if you felt politics was failing in your country? Do you broadly feel, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, that the system ensures that more people feel represented?
Actually, I personally do, and there were not that many hands from the Danish delegation saying that politics. There were not that many hands from the Danes saying that politics fails in Denmark, and I think, well, that's a personal view, that people feel that it's more fair that the votes are divided according to how much where people actually vote, whereas here in Britain the winner takes it all in the constituencies, and that might not be considered to be fair. Also, again, we are lucky we have this welfare state and all that stuff. But again, the electoral system in Britain could be a reason, compared to the Scandinavian country, why people feel that politics fail here. So could I ask you again, Ben, could I suppose changing the electoral system would be possible, but what could be done if that were impossible, if that were possible, that would make politics fail less?
Well, they're talking about it more than they have in the past, but this does happen in the Labour Party before every election. And I have spoken to Labour politicians in the past and suggested to them that if they want to maximise their seats, this wouldn't be the smartest thing for them to do. So you have to be a pretty selfless politician. Yeah.
As soon as you start winning, you don't want to do it.
Andrew Neil, though, was out there saying, PR would lock the right out of power, would keep the left in power forever. And I think, all of you in Denmark know that it has not kept the left in power forever. All the parties would just adjust if we had a system like that. I think it's hard to see how we get to that system.
There was a referendum on changing the voting system. It was the no to AV camp had a lot of people that then went on to the vote leave camp. So for some people, it was their training ground. So, that there was a fairly sort of well-oiled machine trying to stop it from happening. And I think, I might be wrong on this, but I think kind of the country is sort of small c conservative in a lot of ways. Yes. And so there's sort of appetite for incremental change, but not wholesale reform like that, I think.
It's hard to reform an electoral system incrementally.
Yeah.
Or at least for this, yeah. But here's the funny twist in the tale here, which is that many of those Leave EU people were UKIP backers, and UKIP would have done really well with a PR system. And they also did really well because they had a kind of hostile takeover of parts of the Conservative Party, arguably. But, even one thing we've not been very good at is representing groups like UKIP. And in a way, that's partly why Brexit happened. There was a dimension of British politics that hadn't been reflected, hadn't been asked questions. Boris Johnson and co came and they sort of tilted Britain's politics on its axis, split it, found the bigger half on a new dimension of politics, and we've been in those consequences ever since.
And they also did a deal with Farage to get him to stand down in all the seats. So they were supporting people. So it's not just appeal; it's also backroom deals.
Let's hear from some people in the room. Liz first, and then you, sir, you, and Sophia. It's getting busy in the chat. It's not just about Hamlet, right? Liz.
Hello, I'm Liz. I work here at Tortoise. Hi, Ben. I haven't read your book, so forgive me for riffing. There's never been a time in my life, I'm 47, I'm old, that the media, I would say, but in general, people have been like, do you know what? This government's absolutely brilliant. Everything's fine. It's just never happened. And I'm just sort of reflecting on a sort of, maybe it's human nature, maybe it's something uniquely British. I don't know what it is. If you have an adversarial media environment, we've mentioned some of the sort of structural things about fixed-term parliament and those kinds of things, first past the post and those sorts of things. I wonder if it's something to do with power, literally the existence of it. Oh, and it might be naive and obnoxious even to suggest, but whether there would be any different sentiment from we the media, we the electorate, were we to describe the party that won as instead of the party in power, but the party of responsibility. The party who is currently responsible is this party, rather than the party that's currently in power. Would that affect anything? Would that affect, to your point, Kat? And I tend to agree with you. My gut is I don't spend time in the Houses of Parliament. Most MPs are probably broadly in it for the right reasons, but that doesn't mean the culture in Westminster isn't pretty revolting and the wrong things happen. So I don't know if a sort of inflection, we talk about the Peter Parker principle, don't we? Principle here in Tortoise about, I wonder if the inflection is wrong.
I did want to ask, actually, building on Liz's question, you don't really go into the media's responsibility in why politics fails, but I feel like that is a pretty major problem.
And one of the reasons I don't do that is because the book is so global in focus and the media environments are so different. It was hard to...
Yeah.
And if I'd just written about the media, I just would have written about the British media endlessly.
There's a lot to be said.
So I think the media are hugely important in this country because of the overall partisan bias of the media being stronger in the UK than in many, but not all other countries. But I mean by this the print media, because if we were in the States, we would be looking at television news and radio in particular, which lent right there. So even the newspapers are kind of tediously earnest. I mean, God, love the New York Times and the Washington Post, but sometimes just like, guys, just show an opinion. Right?
Write a headline.
I've got to speak up for the New York Times is an unbelievably good paper, quite apart from its political stance. And the Washington, we have no paper in this country that ever did "And All the President's Men." Yeah. Just saying it. Right.
Well, but we have a BBC which, for its sins, I think plays some of the role that those papers of record play. I mean, the interesting thing is that the Times is the paper of record and is not the paper of record in this country in a way that's, I think it feels like the Financial Times is sneaking into that role. But we don't have a clear kind of, umpire newspaper, call the balls as I see them newspaper. They do all have clear biases. And, when
when I was working for the government, I was at HMT, but obviously, good old civil servants, you always take on like the position of the government in the day, and we'd get so irritated at, everything we do is getting criticised. But I don't know if it was just the right-wing media. I think we were annoyed at The Guardian. I think we were annoyed at the BBC as well.
Are we going to try and keep to the order? Yes, sir. Tell us who you are.
My name is Ulrich Egger, and I come from the Constructive Institute as well. And the reason why we are here in Britain is actually due to media. We look into media, and I'm a journalist by training myself, and been running the newsroom of the equivalent of the BBC in Denmark, DR, 1/10 the size, 100% of its problems. But we come here because you most likely have the best journalists in the world and the worst press in the world. And to talk about why politics fails and not include media, I think we have to, and I'm glad we talk about that. There's a leading politician, the most experienced person in the Danish politics. He has put it like this: the press has put a blanket of stupidity over mankind. Because we angle all stories on conflict. And the incentive structure in the political debate is the most rude and the most loud, and the guy with the most likes will run with the attention. And that's how politics is running also in our country sometimes. But here, far worse. In United States, far, far worse. Mm-hmm. So could you elaborate on that? Is that just us thinking that this is not a place that we would like to copy?
Well, don't necessarily copy us, or take all the good journalists, but somehow create a wonderful media in their absence. If I were to have a Why Politics Fails chapter on the media, I would be compelled to use the same set of arguments I used throughout the book. And I think it's pretty clear with the media that the individual incentives of newspapers and journalists don't align necessarily that well with the collective goal of a well-informed, populous, and objective media, because the incentives are so clear in journalism to find audience. And audiences, when they read something, are also not thinking, am I reading a broad, objective account? Or maybe they are, but audiences have a kind of reading portfolio anyway, right? So we all read across different things. So the temptation will be to grab them however you can, and you're going to do that in a BuzzFeedy type way, or you're going to do it in a GB News kind of way. But that's what gets clicks. And look, I now see this as a Substack writer. I can see how different things I write pick people up more, and people love the political stuff.
Yeah, and even getting exclusives can be like that as well, because you're incentivized to sort of maybe go a little bit further than you would feel comfortable. Maybe you're not 100% sure the story is right, but your boss is kind of saying, breathing down your, not here I should add, but breathing down your neck, come on, we got to get it before whoever. And so, people take perhaps more risks. Obviously, we do have quite stringent libel laws here, but I think there is a kind of incentivization to take risks. And actually, on the sort of polarization point, I sort of naively thought that after Brexit was done, that it would all kind of settle down, we'd all be happy again. And then COVID happened. And I was really surprised that British newspapers turned that into a polarising issue as well, and made lockdowns, something you were for or against, not necessarily on the basis of public health, but on the basis of freedom and, kind of all of these sort of, things that we associate with American politics.
You've got like 3 months of newspapers singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah.
And then that was that.
Yeah.
By the summer.
Yeah. And, still now we kind of see, with the lockdown files in the Telegraph, that it sort of reinforces their views that these decisions weren't taken properly. Actually, I don't think that that's what that tranche of texts shows. But if you have a worldview, you'll always be able to justify it with whatever you want.
Now, I'm sure with this gathering, we could spend the whole of the rest of the hour talking about
media.
How media is responsible for all of this. And it is fascinating. But anyway, let's just, I promise you, sir, and then you in the corner, and then we're going to go to Sophie, and we'll get to everybody. Promise.
I will abandon my point about media then.
No. Make it.
And actually, because I was just frantically thinking about, oh my God, I need to talk about media now. So I'm quite happy that I won't have to. I'm going to ask a question if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't actually, compared to everyone else, I don't bring that much knowledge to the room, so it feels more appropriate.
Go ahead. I won't have any.
God, I was wondering, more to you, interacting with politicians, where we're talking about sort of electoral reform and maybe even constitutional reform. And I think, funnily enough, I think almost exactly a year ago, I was sitting in this very room and we were talking about the consensus of, is democracy in the UK working? And I think we came to the consensus that most people here think it's not. And I think one of the reasons that we came to why that is that a lot of people don't feel like their views are represented. One party wins and then the other half, especially at the moment where everyone's divided, the other half gets abandoned. And that even if Labour won and the liberal people got their say and whatever, and the culture, pop culture would be happy, but I think there'll be a huge part of England that wouldn't be happy. And I think what the gentleman from Denmark was trying to say earlier is that actually in countries like Denmark and Germany as well, where I grew up, there's that feeling that no matter how the election goes, you're still represented in quite an active way, and not just the opposition shouting at you, but it doesn't really matter because the government is just going to make decisions anyway. So I was wondering, when it comes to electoral reform and constitutional reform, because the people in power or in responsibility are actually, they've not taken advantage, but they're in favor of no reform because they're in power, and the fold in the system, let's call it a fold if it is, we don't know, I think so, will keep them in power. So why is there any interest to even change it? And Gordon Brown seems to be quite passionate about it at the moment, but otherwise, anyway,
you touched on this. Is there any realistic chance of constitutional reform in this country?
I mean,
Sorry, as someone who actually speaks to politicians,
I don't. Certainly not from the Conservative perspective. I think that Labour have sort of talked about it and then sort of rode back from what they were originally saying, because as we were kind of saying, it's the sort of thing that you say when you're fed up with being in opposition for a long time. I mean, you know, they have made some changes. We touched on it briefly. We talked about some of the changes they made to the House of Lords, where they all but ended hereditary peerages, and you know that is probably one of the most significant sort of constitutional changes in the last 20 years. I think that I'm not sure it's a sort of has a high salience for people, which is a slightly technical political term, but it basically means it's the sort of thing that some people think is probably broadly a good thing, but it's not the reason they go to vote. The reason they go to vote is they can't afford to heat their house or get food, or they want, you know, to be able to actually live in a house, you know, or whatever. There are much more fundamental issues that are higher up the pecking order for most people. So it's the sort of thing that gets put back onto the back burner.
Yeah. It's hard to come up with an argument based around self-interest, and my book is mostly arguments about self-interest, where then people violate that self-interest. So either they have a much longer run view where they think they'll still be fine and make it through the electoral system reform, or they're just this wonderful person that my book doesn't suspect really exists, which is a far-sighted, selfless individual, let alone politician. I think it's very hard. Look, there is one thing we could do, which is think about what our second chamber is.
Yes, I was just going to say, yes. So this is something that Keir Starmer has talked more at length about, which is reforming the House of Lords. So there have been suggestions along the lines of making it more regionally representative. So you have people that come from different parts of the country, and also that they might be elected themselves on a different cycle to the Commons. But there are problems with that. So one of them would be that if you have two different groups, both of whom are elected by the people, who's the primary voice of the people in that instance?
You end up with what we're going through right now in Congress, which is a debt ceiling crisis, where the Republican House don't want Joe Biden's executive, or the Democratic Senate for that matter, to increase the debt limit, and they want to see what they can squeeze out of the Democrats to get there.
And the other problem is, of course, that even if you do have it on a different cycle, let's say, for example, there was the 2019 election for the Commons and then the 2022 election for the Lords, have people really got out of their system what they had in it when they voted for Brexit in 2016 and then for Boris Johnson in 2019. Maybe not. And so you end up with two perhaps quite similar houses in which you've basically got the same people marking each other's homework.
Have there ever been any examples of, I guess, extreme fundamental reform that weren't caused by revolution, civil war, or losing
in this country?
I have to ask the
in Italy and New Zealand both changed their electoral systems from first past the post to majoritarian in the 80s and 90s, and the Italians changed back as well. Now they have this weird hybrid system. I mean, the Greeks right now, right? The Greek election the other day, which New Democracy, the centre-right party, did very well in under a PR rule. One of their plans is to introduce an electoral system that moves a bit further away from PR. But in Greece, there's a complexity that they have to win another election for that electoral reform to be passed. So what you can't do is come in on a manifesto, say, I'm going to change the electoral system and do it right away. You have to win. You have to do the election afterwards. So I suppose that's something we could do here if we wanted to do it.
Bit of a safety check.
Yeah, it's a safety check, exactly. To prevent you from basically, having an election system that says only Conservatives can vote and then having a general election or something like that.
You've been very patient over in the corner. Then we'll come to you, sir. By the way, I'd be really interested to know how weird it seems to you, friends from Denmark, that we have a second chamber whose members are almost entirely appointed by the establishment. I think we lose sight here of how very, very strange that is. But anyway.
Hello. I was wondering what your thoughts are on loyalty to the party versus loyalty to your country. So when the kind of government came down and Rishi Sunak abandoned Boris Johnson, kind of turned on him, there was lots of conversation, especially leading up to like the September leadership election, about how Rishi Sunak had betrayed his party. And I feel like there's kind of a tightrope to walk, because on the one hand, if a party isn't unified, it looks unelectable, doesn't look like it's functioning, isn't kind of worth paying attention to. But at the same time, it needs to, keep its principles. And one reason I often hear journalists choose to not go into politics is they prefer to be disloyal, whereas MPs prefer. It's about Hardman's words.
We want to be disloyal and not have a boss.
But MPs kind of have to kind of stick behind their leader, even if they fundamentally disagree, because they want to get voted in.
So the first part of the book on democracy. So every chapter has a trap. It has a little motif, and the motif there is there's no such thing as the will of the people, which is the kind of thing that political scientists will say, yes, everybody knows this. Everybody knows about Arrow's impossibility theorem, which, of course, most people don't want to know about. But there are a bunch of mathematical arguments about how, with enough weird preferences, there's no true collective decision out there. So we all suspect that in the absence of any other kind of order coming in, there can just be chaos. And so I don't say this in the book. This is the kind of thing you come up with when you speak about a book afterwards that you wish you put in. But the way that we think about parties is as chaos cages. What they do is they add order to what might otherwise be chaotic decision-making. So they play a really, really important role there. And it's very, very easy to use partisan as a slur. But it plays an important role, because look what happened in early 2019 when our parties fell apart. John Bercow thought, my moment has arisen as Speaker of the House. I surely can take all of these disparate views and turn them into something. And he discovered very, very quickly that was not simple. I talk in the book, I went down to Westminster to advise a couple, an MP from, who will go unnamed, an MP from Labour, an MP from the Conservatives, who were part of taking over the order paper. They couldn't figure out how they were going to structure anybody's votes, how they were going to trust each other across parties. And so ultimately we had all these indicative votes that just sort of vanished, right? Puffed away. We had all of these opportunities to consider different options, and no one could even decide on anything. So our political parties, love them or hate them, we might need them. And if I were a Conservative who was concerned about Rishi Sunak stabbing Boris Johnson in the back, that's what I would be concerned about. It's not clear to me that Boris Johnson is especially loyal. It's not an attribute that's regularly attached to him, but still, he was the leader of the party. And to the party, it's a different issue.
Are you saying that ultimately it was the party system as we have it now that saw Westminster through that period of unprecedented chaos. Where the question was how.
So we moved from chaos to polarization, which are the two kind of pivot points, or the end points that I talk about in the democracy chapter. Yeah. We resolved the chaos that we got into in 2019
over Brexit.
By in December of 2019, having what must be the most polarizing set of people imaginable leading our parties, but then having one of them win dramatically.
But ultimately, that was the only way our system could reach a new sort of stability.
Absolutely.
Was by tabula rasa, clean sheet, new election, and a big majority.
Exactly.
Big majority is the key, isn't it?
The big majority was the key, although Boris Johnson still found, even with that majority, he couldn't resolve some of the things that people had disagreed with in Brexit, and hence the Irish border became, a non-soluble problem.
Just on the question of loyalty to the party, what I would say is that I think it fundamentally boils down to self-interest. An MP is far more likely to be elected because they are a Labour MP or a Conservative MP rather than because they are just a wonderful human being. So your loyalty to your party is kind of your meal ticket.
Change UK demonstrated that in a full skeleton in the scaffold.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with Jeremy Corbyn, right? Because you can't really get a much bigger name than him, who is independent, and people are saying he might not win. Now, if he can't win, then no one. Maybe Boris, but people think that they vote in a sort of hard-headed way, but it's so tribal that people just generally go in and think and you see that with local elections.
People are rational. They think, what's this individual going to do on their own outside the party system if they get elected anyway? It's not like Martin Bell, who I think is the only example I can think of a politician. Comes in. It's not like Martin Bell got to do Prime Minister's Question Time.
Yeah, and it's because the party machine churns out the campaign leaflets, does all the promotions. I think, again, we probably underestimate how much of a sort of brand marketing overload parties go into in the run-up to an election. And on your point about why journalists don't want to be MPs, it is because, oh my God, I would not do that job for
a very large number of journalists in this country do become MPs, and a large number of people think that's part of the problem.
That is true, actually. But anyone with any sense wouldn't.
But Sophie, you had your hand up a while ago. It's been busy in the chat. What's been said?
Yes, it has been very busy in the chat. I think a lot of people agreeing with the disenfranchisement and sort of low voter turnout has been a big one. An interesting point raised at the very beginning about market constraints and how all of this is within, governments can only work to some extent with the market. I proposed in the chat that potentially that's a two-way stream, and that when government is working effectively, it should be a two-way stream, although that's obviously up for debate on various political views. Another point that was made was about protest and everything that's been going on in France, and whether or not that is a better indicator of the people speaking out. To which it then brought the age-old question of what is the role of the politician? And I suppose you've got your sort of Burkean representation or Paine and individual. And I think the key thing that has been underlying this, and that was briefly mentioned in the chat, is education, and the fact that a lot of voters can't necessarily make informed choices or don't even understand the choices that are there to be made. Which I think is one that I've certainly had a conversation with Rachel, who you can't see, but is on the tech desk behind me, and who is Swiss, and was saying that the fact that we don't have any kind of citizenship education, to which I argue we do, but it's just very bad, is incredible. And I think something that ought to be discussed a bit more is that lots of people don't necessarily. I think first past the post, for all of its ills, is very simple to understand, and actually why it started is because you put an X in a box. And I think that all of this discussion is because the reason that we have so many tensions is also because this was written 200 years ago. It was a very different political landscape, but also it's become more complicated because there are more of us, and the challenges we have are greater, and we're much more globally interconnected, and all of these kind of big big wholesale problems, as well as the fact that you still can't afford your heating bill or put food on the table. And I think those are sort of big challenges why the question is huge and also tiny.
Thanks, Sophie. You do write in the book that the problem is us, don't you?
Yeah, and the problem is us. But what I want to be also clear about, and say in the book, is the problem is us, not because people are ill-informed or ill-educated, but because actually all of us are human beings who are pretty smart. So the problem is that dealing with really smart people who can do what they want to do, that's the hard bit. If we were all just sacks of potatoes, then I suppose it would be easier to solve political problems. But many leaders of the past have found that their population is only a sack of potatoes under certain conditions and can rise up in response. A couple of quick points. So I think the French, uniquely among European nations, detest their political system. And if I were to flag, where to watch for something crazy happening politically in the next 10 years in Europe, it would almost certainly be France, because I do not see what happens post-Macron. What could happen is Marine Le Pen or Maréchal, her niece. But I don't know who reappears in the kind of Macron position. And there's so much protest, and there always is in France, but there's also just incredibly low support for their politicians. So I do think that to some extent we have more support and more trust in our politicians than in some other countries, which also, by the way, have kind of majoritarian style electoral systems. It's true in France for the presidency.
We are nearly out of time. That's what that yellow stripe means. So we'll have two more from the... I'm going to give you the last word, Paul, but you raised your hand earlier. Do we have a microphone for you?
I'll speak up. More than anything, it was...
We have to get you a mic just so the people online can hear.
Okay, so my name is Peter, also from the Constructive Institute. More than anything, it was a comment to the question about can you change these electoral systems. And I just think sometimes we underestimate the fact that informal institutions can also play an important role. So for example, the most gridlocked system right now is probably the US system, where a reform of the electoral college is almost impossible to think. But at the same time, you see various states and not insignificant number of states actually change their local regional legislations and make sort of informal agreements. In Denmark, where we come from, we have informal settlements that are not rooted in any constitution or in any law. But if you break those, the sanctions are pretty severe for your political survival in the end. So I think maybe it's also a lot of these laws, as you mentioned, were sort of written in hindsight. You couldn't expect how difficult it would be to change them. So maybe we have to rely more on informal institutions that actually, in a Danish context, oftentimes are as strong. They may not be over as long periods of time, but they hold qualities, unique qualities themselves.
Thank you. Would you like to pass the mic to Paul?
Lack of written constitution as well, because I feel like that's been...
Well,
the jury's out as to whether or not we have a constitution.
So I think perhaps we have believed that the unwritten norms that we have were really important safeguards. And there might be a self-fulfilling prophecy that when you violate those norms, that we've sort of undermined the whole system. I did write a textbook chapter about 15 years ago with my colleague for a US college students, Comparative Politics, We Did Britain. And our chapter was titled, Why Does This Country with No Rules Follow Them? And we argued, one is these long-term historical norms, but there are other issues. A very vibrant civil society. So we complain about the media here, but they also do hold our governments to account. Highly oppositional politics in Parliament with a shadow cabinet that means something. Again, we would lose that with FPTP. But one thing that we have lost is we also were constrained from above by the rules of the European Union. Those have gone. And arguably the media is, when the media pushes in one direction, that herd effect happens. When the opposition is fundamentally split and doesn't trust its own leader, as was true between the years of 2015 and 2019 in this country, that weakens it. And so I think a lot of these safeguards we have were not written down, they did matter, and they've weakened in recent years.
Paul?
Yeah. So I started my day in the Institute for Government this morning, and we were talking about civil service and impartiality.
I was following it on Twitter like a nerd.
Excellent. And one of the key things I think that brought up was, one, how important the civil service is to a historic continuity of management and government. But at the same time, there is a dramatic shift in the type of people who work in the civil service. And to answer the question why politics fails, it appears to be that we've now created a civil service that can only come from the rich, because people can't afford to live in central London, and therefore there's not a diverse voice in the civil service. And at the same time, we've got a myopic sort of viewpoint coming from politicians who are not coming from a vast array themselves, because we've now created this notion of the professional politician after Blair and the sort of introduction of councillors and money.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're interested in what my other kind of main theme of my work is, it's about housing. And I think Britain's housing market creates all of these prosperity traps for us, not least of which is it's reduced internal mobility in this country dramatically, because it's locked people in poorer areas out of London. And frankly, it's locked people into London because they don't want to move elsewhere and lose the rise in house price. When I worked in the civil service, so I worked at the Treasury and I was a fast streamer for some of that, it was still a mix of Southern privately educated people. I'm a Southern privately educated person, you can probably tell from my accent. But there was some regional diversity there. There was not a lot of university diversity in the Treasury. So I think the big issue that I was concerned about with the civil service at the time was that it was extremely good at training generalists, bright young things, which, by the way, is also going to lead itself to a certain demographic, right, who can afford to live in London and be a bright young thing and has that way of presenting themselves. And it really was not effective at having expertise develop in ministries over time. And if our politicians can't do that because they're so driven by the short term, then we absolutely have to have our civil service do that. And I think civil service hiring structures and promotion structures in particular are so pyramid-shaped and up or out and value generalism, which is an important skill in some ways, but not in everything. I think that weakens our decision-making as a country.
And I think when I was doing the podcast on Boris Johnson, I was talking to people about the civil service, and they were talking about Simon Case, and one of the reasons why he was appointed by Dominic Cummings was, because he wanted to reform the civil service. But the fundamental reason was that he although he had worked in the civil service, he wasn't part of any big tribe in the same way that most people are. So he's not sort of, he wasn't a permanent secretary. He wasn't sort of a particular department. So he wasn't a sort of acolyte of any one person. And so that meant that he was kind of a bit more rootless, and therefore, I suppose Cummings would say, a bit more disloyal. But the fact of the tribes is very real, and it's almost like you've got your own kind of political parties within the civil service.
And HMT is such a powerful entity, and I worked there. I love it. I have a lot of team spirit, but that's because they inculcated it. So, and it is full of incredibly smart people, but in a country where our decisions are so centralized and can be made from on high, having a super powerful central finance ministry that can dictate to everybody else amplifies that effect.
And just to the point about MPs also not being representative, not to discourage people from buying Ben's brilliant book, but if you wanted to buy another brilliant book, Isabel Hardman's Why We Get the Wrong Politicians, it really explores the sort of the various barriers to entry, and again, why, frankly, I will never be an MP.
We are out of time. It's a huge book. It's a huge subject, so I'm not surprised we're out of time, but there are huge aspects to it that we simply haven't got to. Two questions that I wanted to ask, but we don't have time. Maybe we can talk amongst ourselves a little bit after this, is what defense mechanisms would you recommend for democracies generally against the big external threats represented by Russia and China principally at the moment? And also, we can't look around corners, but you write quite a lot about the idea of a wealth tax, the idea of a universal basic income as mechanisms for sort of wholesale wealth redistribution. And I'm interested to know whether possibly with change of government, which is expected, that the landscape might be changing fundamentally in favour of those kinds of ideas, which hitherto have been anathema here. But I'm not going to ask you to answer them right now, unless you can do it in just a couple of minutes?
I can say on the wealth tax that, I was down at the all-party parliamentary group about wealth taxation recently, presenting my deeply depressing survey research that suggests that while MPs might quite like a wealth tax, the British public is very, very leery about the actually existing wealth taxes we do have. So inheritance tax and stamp duty are the two least popular tax, or the two taxes that British people think are most unfair. Or do people think is fair? Income tax and national insurance.
The most regressive.
So it's going to be enormously difficult to achieve that.
Likewise, a global wealth tax or even a global income tax to try and stop the sort of, people jumping jurisdictions is, again, seems very sensible, but is politically very, very difficult to get across. I mean, I was at the CDO conference in Bournemouth, the Conservative Democratic Organisation conference in Bournemouth, and it was one of the reasons, the fact that Penny Mordaunt had sort of once backed it was one of the reasons why people were saying she's not a proper Tory. So
I do think this really rubs up against people's views about equal freedoms, actually. I think that the idea that you can't pass things on to your children, that you can't dispose of your money.
It's fundamental to a conservative worldview.
And it's fundamental to a small c conservative attitude that many British people have, that I actually think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves probably understand, but they'll need to understand it because that'll be a political arsenic for them.
Okay, well, what are we getting wrong? In 5 words, representation, language, to Liz's point, the media, especially in this country. In France, they're getting a whole lot of other things wrong. I'm fascinated by your forecast of maybe a 6th republic within 10 years.
I'm trying to get back here in 10 years' time. Be tested on that.
And finally, the notion that even if we may despair of formal change or be beating a dead horse there, that informal changes might fill the breach. And that's, in a sense, aligns with your theme of leaning into the institutions that are the glue between our elections. Ben, Cat, all of you, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. To see our latest videos, head on over to our channel and don't forget to subscribe.